Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our event, Ocean Shocks, Key Issues for Equity and Justice. My name's Harriet Harden-Davies, and I have the pleasure of co-hosting this webinar today with my colleague and friend, Dr. Gerald Singh, who you'll be meeting very shortly. The Decade Outcome 4 is a predicted ocean where society understands and can respond to changing ocean conditions. How can we ensure through the decade that those responses to a changing ocean produce equitable outcomes? And what can we do about sudden shocks? To what extent can we predict them? And how can we continue to provide equity considerations into those responses? That is what we're going to be talking about today. We have two panels, a wonderful set of panelists, and then a facilitated discussion at the end. And we're very much looking forward to hearing from you as well as this webinar continues. On that note, I'd like to hand over to my co-host, Gerald Singh, to kickstart our event today. Gerald, over to you.
Thank you, Harriet. Hi, everyone. I'm Gerald Singh. I'm a Deputy Research Director for the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus program. Very happy for everyone to join us today. Really excited about our panels. Before we get into them specifically, there is a little bit of housekeeping to take care of. Before we get into all of this, though, I also want to really ensure we're not kind of crass and heartless with our treatment of the issues we'll be talking about today. I really do want to emphasize we're going to be discussing events that have led to lost lives and ruined lives, and we don't want to take that lightly. So we do want to make sure we recognize that disasters and disaster studies itself is a challenging field to discuss. So thank you for everyone for taking part in this. Now to housekeeping issues. This event will be recorded. However, we're not going to be freely sharing the recording for everyone. So it's more for our kind of internal use. We also have something called a jam board. So that's going to be something we'll talk about in a second here. This is a resource we're going to use throughout this session, and it's going to be our way to engage with you, all of our audience members. So the Jamboard is really a place for you to add your thoughts on the questions posed to the panelists. So it's your way to engage with those questions. And we'll really try to, it's also a place for you to pose your own questions so that we will hopefully be able to address in the final panel session. So that's going to be the more free flow discussion among all the panelists. Be sure to check out the chat feature on Zoom because Constance, one of our behind the scenes people, is going to be posting important information there, including the link to the Jamboard. So please keep an eye out on that. Without further ado, then I think we're ready to move into the first panel. So for the first panel, we are really delighted to have a series of speakers here. I'll quickly introduce them before getting into the questions. So we're very, very fortunate to have Dr. Thomas Fröhlicher here. He's currently an SNSF Assistant Professor at the Climate and Environmental Physics Division of the University of Bern and the head of the Ocean Modeling Group. He's interested in marine ecosystem carbon-climate interactions with a focus on ocean extreme events and their impacts on marine organisms and ecosystem services. He studied environmental science at ETH Zurich and graduated in physics with a summa cum laude at the University of Bern. Thank you, Thomas. We also have Dr. Wilf Schwartz. He's a fisheries economist and focuses primarily on seafood supply chain management. Specifically corporate social responsibility policies in the seafood industry and sustainability standards. He's been with the Nippon Foundation Nereus program since first as a research fellow, and now he's a program manager. Dr. Schwartz has also worked at a research officer with the World Trade Organization and is currently the director of environmental policy at the Ocean Policy Research Institute. Or that he did serve that role in the past. We also have Dr. Tiffany Kenny, who's interested in human dependency on biodiversity for nutrition and food security. Her research employs participatory and system-based methodologies to examine the links between marine environments and human health, with a particular focus on ecological, environmental, and economic dimensions of indigenous peoples' food systems. Dr. Kenny holds a Bachelor of Engineering and a Master's of Science in Biosystem Engineering from McGill University and a PhD in Biology from the University of Ottawa. Finally, we have Dr. Yoshitaka Ota, who's the director of the Ocean Nexus Center, and he's a research assistant professor at the University of Washington. He has conducted ethnographic research on various coastal communities, including Palau, the UK, Indonesia, and Japan, studying the socialization and cultural meanings associated with fishing practices. His core research is also to understand how to strengthen social equity and ocean governance while we face global changes. So very, very happy to have the panel with us today. And we're going to start with some questions that have been sent around previously. But just to set the stage, this is a session all about sudden shocks in marine ecosystems. Maybe we can go around the panel and ask what do we mean when we're talking about sudden shocks? And maybe that's something we can turn first to Thomas, since that's a key area of your research.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Gerald, also for the invitation to be part of this panel. I'm very pleased that you brought up this topic of sudden shocks or extreme events or abrupt changes in the ocean, because that's really at the heart of my own research. So, what I understand from as an ocean shock is actually from a physical biogeochemical perspective. These are, for example, marine heat waves, like really strong hot temperature anomalies in the ocean, which can actually last for several days or few weeks or even years. They can extend up to more than hundreds of square kilometers in the ocean and can also penetrate into the deep ocean. But other extremes or ocean shocks are biogeochemical extremes like low oxygen, or acidity extremes, or in particular what we are studying now is compound events. So if these shocks actually coming together, like if you have a heat wave on top of a high acidity event or a low oxygen event, which can then impact marine ecosystems. So that's what I understand as an ocean shock. Yeah.
Great. I also know that Dr. Schwartz, you study shocks from a different perspective than biogeochemical. Can you give us a sense of what you think of when you hear shock?
Yeah, so I'm an economist, I'm looking at things from economic perspectives. How does different shocks permeate through the economy and impact people's economic activities? And so in that sense, with 200 million confirmed cases and the number of deaths approaching 5 million, what we are going through right now, the COVID-19 pandemic, is first and foremost, a human public health crisis. But for majority of us, this was through. This is more of an economic impact. The impact of majority of people is through disruption in economy, and so fisheries, which is what I study, regularly encounters different types of economic shocks. We had in 2008 a huge fluctuation in price of fuel from jumping doubling in early 2008, and then by the second half of the year, everything collapsed to quarter of what we started. We also went through a similar type of shocks in 2019 and early 2020 between United States and China, as they were disputing over intellectual property, which led to a trade dispute, which caused an impact on the way some of the seafood commodities like lobsters being traded, and that had repercussions both for U.S. fisheries and also created a boom outside of the U.S., for example, in Canada. And so these are kind of shocks that we talk about. These are, it's not something that we can predict, but we know these kind of variabilities or disruption happens quite frequently. In the case of COVID-19, we can kind of predict what were the main drivers, what were the main response. But if you look at case by case, that's not really universal. For example, me and my colleague here at Dalhousie University has been looking at some of the price fluctuations of the seafood wholesale price, yeah, and we can see that the response, some of the commodities has collapsed to the degree up to like 70% of the previous year's baseline, but some didn't. And so the idea that everything responding the same way is not actually the case, and that's what we're seeing here.
So really interesting. I mean, so it sounds like you're bringing up shocks not just as oceans change, but what happens on the ocean changes from shocks to human health and economic systems as well. I just want to make sure we capture everyone else in the panel here. So maybe Dr. Kenny, I'll turn to you and just ask the same question. What are some sudden shocks what do you think of when you hear sudden shock?
Yes, and I very much appreciated that Dr. Frolicker brought up this matter of compounding events. So for several years now, I worked in the Arctic among Inuit communities, and already there's housing crisis. There's not pandemics, but there's been epidemics of tuberculosis that remain ongoing, and there are important public health crises, and also really high levels of food insecurity. And in 2018, so these communities are mostly, they tend to be coastal, and they rely on market foods, and they also rely on imported foods. And a lot of that food is imported from marine shipping or has to be flown in. And I was in one particular community in Polytech in 2018 where the annual barge service couldn't get to the community to deliver essential goods, so heating fuel, chlorine for municipal water treatment, ATVs and construction material for people to go out on the land and to build their cabins, and then also all of this non-perishable food. And a lot of this was because of impassable ice. So it was ice that had melted up from the high Arctic and had settled in the bay near the community there. And then the boat couldn't get there to make its delivery. And so in public health, we have a term called syndemic, and this is when you have multiple overlapping epidemics or pandemics, or how public health issues compound or are compounded by social conditions. And so when disruptions happen in ocean ecosystems or environments, it can or it can aggravate already very serious social and public health issues there. So, and a lot of this is unaccounted for because in public health, we don't necessarily have, the studies are very complicated. They take time with human participants. And so these kind of events or disruptions can have really serious implications that are not necessarily documented or known beyond community voices. And so hearing those voices from people is very, very important.
So again, very interesting. I mean, getting to shocks in coastal communities, and that leads me to our final panelist, Dr. Yoshitaka Ota. I'll pose the question for you as well, just to engage with the discussion here. What does sudden shock mean to you in an ocean setting?
Okay, thank you very much, Gerald. Thanks a lot for the speaker's comment. When I hear the sudden shocks, I mean, obviously, what comes up to my mind is something I experienced 10 years ago when Great East Japan earthquake happened, and followed up with the tsunami, and then accident of the Fukushima nuclear plant. So it was really a compound impact in very short time. I'm talking about like a couple of hours, really. And I was in Tokyo at that time, and I was just watching everything. The tsunami came along and hit almost like 300 to 500 kilometers on the coastal line. There are 300 ports which are completely damaged by the tsunami, and unfortunate death of 20,000 people, was almost drowning because of the tsunami. And it was really sudden, and there was a caution, there's also prevention, and then there's also understanding of what the risks are already set up in those coastal communities, and people sort of like ready, but yet not at this scale. So this really was a sudden shock without, something we couldn't really predict. And, there was sort of like unintended, something beyond the scale of the prediction, all came up in a discussion afterwards. But what I feel really sudden shock to the marine ecosystem is the shocks happened at that time, and then also shocks is still continue to happen as recovery and new way of prevent those accident is happening. So between the people who actually experienced this and really wanted to have a safe space, and also the consideration of the marine ecosystem, impact of the marine ecosystem for the seawalls and everything else, it's really hard things to discuss about it. And it's been 10 years, but it's still going on, obviously. So what I'm thinking is really these impacts are coming both short time and medium time, but it's also very long time. And it really includes impact on coastal communities and ecosystem, including coastal communities.
Thank you, Dr. Oda. So that makes me wonder about, I guess, the frequency of seeing these kinds of shocks and what leads to them, because some of what you were saying makes me think that we're changing the underlying conditions that maybe might lead to more impacts in the future. Just given trajectories, how we're seeing global change and ocean change in general, will these shocks we're talking about here be more common? This is open to anyone.
So maybe I can start with the heat wave, because there I think we have a pretty good understanding of how the frequency of such events will actually change under global warming, and they will actually change quite rapidly and strongly. So what we found is, and also what the IPCC has assessed, is that the frequency of heat waves at the global scale have doubled. So the number of days of heat waves per year have doubled since the beginning of the satellite period, where you have really good high temporal and spatial data in the ocean to assess sea surface temperature changes. And what we also know is actually that the driver of these changes is just the mean global sea surface temperature changes, so the ocean warming, which happened over the last 50 years, or which actually happened since the pre-industrial. And so what we know is that some actually heat waves, like the blob, which was a really big heat wave in 2013 to 2015, that one, which had really big impacts on all sorts of organisms and also ecosystems and socioeconomic systems. Such a heat wave would not have been occurred without human-caused global warming, according to our models, which we have at hand. And looking into the future, because of ongoing global warming, the intensity and frequency and also the duration of these events will actually is projected to increase. And so, but not everywhere at the same pace. So, for example, in the low latitudes, so in the equatorial regions, the increase in these events, in the number of these events, will be biggest, as well as in the Arctic Ocean, where the sea ice is retreating and the ocean can take up a lot of heat, and therefore increase the probability of heat waves occurring. So that's what the models show, and that's also what we know from what satellite data shows us over the last 30 years or 35 years. So these events, at least in terms of heat wave events, they will become more frequent and more intense. Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas. So, I mean, you mentioned how these are projected to be even more compound in the Arctic. So maybe I'll turn to Tiffany. Around the frequency of events, are we seeing more shocks more frequently?
Yeah, I think the sea ice decline has been gradual. It's been about 13% decline in terms of its extent, and then it's declined by about 1.75 meters as well. So in terms of its thickness, but I think what's particularly concerning, so we know that by about 2050 that the Arctic will be virtually free of sea ice, at least in the summer or in September. And so I think one of the things that's most concerning is our failure to learn from and acknowledge the way that these changes have impacted people and to create responses according to that. And so by that, I mean, so when the barge was canceled in the Western Arctic in 2018, this was blamed on impassable ice. It was blamed on high water levels, and it was blamed on a number of logistical factors, but there's other issues that compounded it as well. And so, for example, priority was given to shipping industrial materials and goods instead of servicing the communities. And this is something that the mayors of the affected communities have said, is that, you know, if there's no acknowledgement by government that there was a mistake and a failure, that information and predictions weren't used to the benefit of people and to ensure their security, their wellness, their food security, then how are we going to develop plans in the future if we don't recognize where we have made mistakes or had the absence of a proper emergency response plan?
Interesting. So it's not just the underlying changing ocean; it's also factors related to our responses. Yoshi and Wilf, interested in your perspective on the frequency of shocks related to economic and social settings.
Wilf, can I go first? All right. Thank you. So this summer I went back to Japan and I just started noticing this enormous change in terms of frequency of the heavy rain. And it's not talking about like a normal rain, but it's just really, really heavy rain and it started coming up to Japan and everywhere. And it really caused a flood, landslides, and then all sorts. And it was really such a disaster, you know, compounded with COVID. So the people have to evacuate it somewhere else to go and be together. But at the same time, pandemic is happening, and there was potentially sort of like issues and a fear of earthquake or any other disaster would hit. So it's really is creating kind of like a very vulnerable situation in some of the people. But at the same time, the consideration of the treatment and more or less, you know, according to Thomas, is going to happen more, and adaptation is really still being talked in a very much infrastructure base. Okay, we got to create more resilient, you know, more concrete, more strong, you know, that's really the talk about it, or really on the global scale. So we have to really reduce emission and then all this. So really coming back to what Tiffany said, how can we actually solve this communities and really sort of like not just talking about the vulnerability, which is really everywhere now, even in Japan, but how can we actually do it with equity and justice in our mind is really coming up as a discussion, and it's very important. You can actually see it more and more, and as the frequency of the disaster and the compounded disaster happens.
Yeah, and in terms of economic impact and implications, there are a few triggers that are predictable. For example, what Thomas was discussing about increasing frequency of extreme events, kind of affecting the productivity or supply end of the seafood industry. But at the same time, there are other triggers that are fairly unpredictable, such as, you know, a trade dispute in totally unrelated sector spiraling into you know, a global issue and impacting fisheries and seafood supply chain. But we can all, what is increasingly happening is that because of the interconnectedness of the different supply chain and different networks, you know, these triggers tend to permeate much widely than it was before. So, you know, even last 15, 20 years, you know, the effect of some kind of disruption in one end of the world is having implication beyond. At the same time, economy tend to evolve and adapt very quickly, and so to say that because what happened in this particular case, what happened as a response to the pandemic in 2020, doesn't necessarily mean the economy will respond in a similar way 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line. And so that's another thing we need to understand, is that yes, there are some things that are predictable, but at the same time there are other dynamics that's going to be different next time, and that's something that we need to keep track of, and that's something that we need to be aware of when we try to prescribe different mitigation options or policy.
So Wilf raises a really interesting point around prediction. I mean, this is a session on the predicted ocean, but Wilf is throwing down the gauntlet a bit, saying that there's not everything we can predict. And so I think that's a really important thing to discuss, is to really get a sense of how much you think us as a science community can predict sudden shocks and their impacts on coastal communities. So here's our chance to talk about what we think is predictable and what isn't. I'll open this to anyone here.
Can I just start?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. So I think there are a lot of ways to predict both sudden and gradual shocks, changing marine ecosystem and the marine ecosystem plus coastal communities. And this would be really possible, but the way we predict it, and particularly for our kind of like a vulnerability towards shock, is still quite limited. It's often to be kind of like a layer down the issues and setting up and create kind of like a hotspot of the vulnerability, or actually, and it's usually very much geographical. So if you actually wanted to really see about the prediction, much more useful for the policies, what we really need to think about is, where socially people are, I wouldn't say the vulnerable, but at the risk. What kind of like a decision-making process is really not having enough transparency and weak in the sudden shocks. When the shocks happens, people like have to make decisions very quickly, and it's usually not transparent and accountable. And then that's what we really need to have to be prepared. So the science prediction is great, but to reflect on policies, we really have to think about the governance, which is basically making the process of making decisions. And then that's why I think we need to work on.
Great, thanks, Yoshi. I'll just take Wilf, before I get to you, I'll just remind all our audience here that the Jamboard is there for you to use. If you do have particular questions for the panelists, please post them there. If you have your own opinions on the topics posed in the panels, please also use the Jamboard to post your thoughts. I think they're anonymous, so you shouldn't be afraid to reveal yourself when doing so. So Wilf, I'll turn to you. I saw your hand up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up on your Dr. Oda's point about identifying areas of vulnerability. When we do predictions, when we can kind of forecast a general trend. What are the average response? But when we're talking about equity, or when we're talking about vulnerability, especially when we talk about economic security, what we are concerned about is economic security of individuals. We want to make sure that the individual, we're not really. Yes, we want to know what the economic response is going to be. Broadly speaking, in the sector or in the industry. But ultimately, what we want to address is the vulnerability of individuals. And so that's where we need to make sure that we don't get too caught up on this idea of generalized trend, and that we focus on ensuring understanding and ensuring conditions of individuals.
Okay. Thanks, Wilf. Tiffany, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, just further to that, I think having witnessed this issue in Polytech, one of the things that it left me thinking was, who does prediction serve? Because the global narrative is of sea ice decline and of increasing shipping routes through the Northwest Passage and infrastructure development and China's Polar Silk Road strategy. So there's a lot of really complicated geopolitics that have taken center stage in this issue. And I bet very few people have heard about the fact that, in fact, sea ice or its changing conditions are preventing harvesters from accessing traditional foods, and it's impacting boats from reaching communities to deliver essential items. And I've really wondered, and it's a question I had for Thomas, is this something that we could have predicted? And if we could have predicted it, could we have put a better plan in place? Or could a better plan have been put in place to ensure people's food security and their health and well-being is not disrupted? Recognizing that there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in different human and biophysical factors.
Well, Thomas, the question was posed to you, so I'll turn to you.
Yes, I mean, in climate science, I mean, prediction is a really big field at the moment. There are a lot of people actually try to predict the climate on the seasonal to decadal timescale into the future and try to understand what happens actually in the next few days, 2 months, 2 years. However, I mean, there are some skillful seasonal to decadal forecasts, for example, of heat waves available at the regional scales, and which also help to reduce the vulnerability in the areas of fisheries, for example, and tourism and conservation. But I think these systems are yet unproven at the really large scale. And one reason is because we are lacking a lot of data in the ocean to actually initialize these prediction systems. But now with the new Argo and deep Argo floats and the bio-Argo floats may help in this regard to further develop these prediction systems, for example, for subsurface marine heat waves and so on. And we also have, monitoring systems which may help to predict things. I mean, NOAA has this coral reef watch. So they use these satellite temperatures to provide near real-time warning of coral bleaching. And they can also give some guidance to coral reef managers and scientists and other stakeholders if the threshold is reached soon or so on. So they can prepare or they can adapt to these changes. And I think one thing, when we talk about the extremes, one thing which is also sometimes confusing is that people do not understand what actually a heat wave is, because there are so many different definitions of a heat wave. I mean, for hurricanes, it's pretty simple. You have a hurricane category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you know how strong it is and what wind speed it has and how much damage it may produce. But for heat waves, that is not really well established. And now some people have come up with a similar categorization scheme for heat waves, where you also have this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categorizations, and then it's probably easier to understand if we have a heat wave with a category 5, that is a really a big heat wave, which may have big impact, and one with a category 1 is a smaller one, which still may have some impact, but with smaller impact. So I think these matrices and the clear language can also help to predict, or at least that the people understand what may happen in the near future. Yeah.
Thanks, Thomas. We have 1 more minute left in this panel. Yoshi, I see your hand up, so I'll turn to you.
Thomas, there's always confusion over the definitions and argument about those, but to be quite honest, I mean, for the people who's actually potentially being a victim, and it's all what they said, it's so hard to define, really. It's like it's not really the heat going up to the temperature, and obviously there's sort of like difficulties and discussions about it. But to make it much more practically useful, what do you think is stopping the group of the scientists, including yourself, to really have clear heat wave definitions? Is it scientific issues, or is it political issues, or what is it making it complicated, please?
Well, I think the biggest knowledge gap is still how heat waves actually impact the marine life and then the coastal communities. And of course, each definition then depends on, you want to know how vulnerable a certain system is, and then you can actually define your physical biogeochemical variable accordingly. But we do not really have a good understanding of the different organisms and ecosystems, how they respond to sudden shocks and really rapid shocks. And I think that's really the big lack.
But you can define it.
Understanding.
Do you think you can define it according to the temperature? It's not that simple, is it? I mean, it's obviously it's really different impacts in the different communities and ecosystems. But heat wave itself, to me, is like really depends on the temperature. So it might go up or it might go down, might be big or small. I mean, it's kind of like a simple categorization could be possible, really.
Well, I mean, when you look at fisheries, a fish or so, they have different thermal windows where they live in. Not so a heat wave of 1 degree for one certain species doesn't really matter for a species which is not close to the thermal window they normally live in. And for other species, 1 degree is already too much. And there are species which can maybe adapt to the changes by just leaving this certain piece of the ocean and just go deeper or go to higher latitudes or so. I think that depends on a lot of different things. And it's really difficult, I think, to generalize all these things into one common metric, yes.
So thank you. I'm going to just quickly close. I think we're out of time for this session. There will be time in the third session to revisit some of these, to revisit more of these questions. I mean, I have some more, and I know Yoshi does too, and I'm sure he'll be able to pose them then. Thank you so much. Panel 1 we'll bring you in again for panel 3. But I want to make sure I'm now turning towards our second panel. And here we have another fine cadre of researchers. We're going to turn away from just thinking about predicting shocks themselves to thinking about responses to sudden shocks. So that is, what do we do about shocks? So for this panel, we're really lucky to have another group of researchers, including Dr. Frédérique Fardin. She's an associate PhD student with the University of Cambridge at UNEP, where her research focuses on the vulnerability and adaptive capacity of mangroves and fishing communities to climate change, and does a lot of her work in Southeast Asia and the Caribbean. She has background in ecology and evolution with a major in tropical terrestrial ecosystems. So prior to her PhD, Dr. Fardin worked in the Caribbean over a period of 3 years for the Regional Activity Center for the Protocol for Specially Protected Areas and Wildlife. We also have Dr. Andres Cisneros Montemayor. He's Deputy Director for the Ocean Nexus Program, and he's new assistant professor at Simon Fraser University. He specializes in applied resource economics and is engaged in research and policy on human development in the blue economy, including artisanal and indigenous fisheries, ecotourism, and emerging ocean sectors in developing and developed economies. He's an active participant and advisor in international and national ocean policy. We also have Dr. Marlene Schutter. She's a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Washington and World Fish. Her work focuses on the relationship between people and the sea, with an explicit aim to address equity and justice issues in the emergent blue economy. She obtained her PhD in environmental social science from Lancaster University, where she researched the extent to which evolving landscape of ocean governance contributes to the representation and alignment of different values, worldviews, and images of all actors involved. And finally, for this session, we're also lucky to have Dr. William Chung, who's a professor at the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries in UBC. And he's now also the director of that institute, and he's the science director for the Nippon Foundation Nereus program. His main research areas include understanding the responses and vulnerabilities of marine ecosystems and fisheries to global change, and examining trade-offs in managing and conserving living marine resources. His work cuts across multiple disciplines, including oceanography, ecology, economics, social sciences, and his work ranges from local to global scales. So thank you all for joining our second session, where we're going to be discussing responses to sudden shocks. So for this session, again, I'm going to start with a question to kind of set the stage. We just, for the past half hour or so, we were discussing what some sudden shocks in an ocean system are. And now I want to get a sense of what are some kinds of proposed and potential responses to sudden shocks in the ocean system. So for that, maybe I'll start with William.
Thank you. Thanks, Jared. Let me build on the wonderful comments from the earlier panel. I think there has been a lot of examples of the different shocks to people and to ecosystems, and I think one of the aspects that we learn from those examples is that it has a disproportionate impacts on the vulnerable groups that are already stressed by multiple pressures. I think the COVID-19 pandemic is a really good example, and also examples on marine heat waves that Thomas highlighted is also illustrate that. And one aspect of that is we talk a lot about the hazards, like heat waves or the transmissible diseases or a tsunami or earthquake. But then actually, if we look at the current data, a big part of the impacts from those extreme events or shocks are actually the exposure component. So in addition to increasing frequency or intensity, there's also an increasing exposure of people to those events, people moving closer to shore or living in areas that are actually more vulnerable or exposed to those shocks, like flooding and things like that. And so I think one of the main response that would be really effective, and that particularly on the vulnerable groups, both within the countries or globally, is to reduce exposure. And that, although it sounds simple, but then it is, as you know, is a complicated problem because it involves socioeconomic development and different planning and things like that. But I think that's an area that it will be important to focus on in addressing the impacts and responses to shocks. Thanks.
Thanks, William. That's an interesting point on reducing exposure. Can I just press you for specific examples?
Yes, sure. So, for example, in fisheries, for example, that we know some of the regions of fisheries are really sensitive to environmental perturbations compared to the other. So I think trying to think about how to diversify the fisheries so that they are less exposed to those changes that are most sensitive to say marine heat waves, or similarly in terms of the storms and particularly exacerbated by sea level rises, and that whether we can manage the planning so that we can reduce the people who are living in unprotected shores that are exposed to those storm events. I think that's another example of those reduction in exposure.
Thank you, William. I'll turn it to someone else in the panel here. William gave a nice overview from a very kind of risk and risk management perspective. Marlene, I'm wondering what you think of this issue on proposed and potential responses, knowing that you come from more of a governance lens.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah. So I think from a governance point of view, it's important to distinguish impacts on people from shocks directly, and also potential impacts on people from the responses to those shocks. So if we would take an example, I'll take an example from coral reef ecosystems. when coral bleaching happens, which is something that Thomas already mentioned as well. Corals turn white basically, and they can actually eventually die as well. I guess the trouble with dealing with a shock like that is that the response necessitates something at a large scale, but also often requires something on a more local scale. And obviously, people who are dependent on coral reefs for small scale fishes, for example, they will be impacted by the shock directly, if that means that there will be fewer fish to catch, for example. But if one of the responses to coral bleaching events is to increase protection, for example, through marine protected areas, I think it's important to also take into account the effects that the response might actually have. So whilst increasing marine protected areas could help to mitigate impacts from this shock of coral bleaching, it could also exacerbate the impacts that people are already feeling from the shock, for example, through loss of access or impacts on food and nutrition security, or livelihoods more broadly. So when thinking about quite specific responses to shocks, I think it's really worthwhile asking, what is this a response to? But maybe that will come up later as well. But I think it can be quite revealing to see what kind of challenges are being neutralized. So is this and what's prioritized in that as well? So when a shock like coral bleaching happens, what's the sort of apparent priority in the response that's given?
Thanks, Marlene. You bring up a very compelling issue about how responses themselves have impacts. And maybe I'll turn to Frederic now. Just in your experience, you do a lot of work more on the ground in mangrove systems and coastal systems. And can you speak to some of what Marlene has pointed out about facing shocks and then seeing the effects of some of the responses?
Well, what Marlene just said about coral reefs, for example, to me, it's important to understand and to look at the perception of the people and what they refer to as sudden shocks. And I would say that in what I've studied so far in the Caribbean, it would be more hurricanes and earthquake. If you answer directly to that question, what are you seeing like sudden shocks? And even if coral reef bleaching should be as well, I think that is actually a challenge, that this type of shocks that we as scientists are collecting, are describing, are not yet directly understood by the population, even if they will see the impact, but they will not always make this link between the two, or if they do, they see it as more something that is long-term. So that's the first thing. And when we talk about climate change, we also consider long-term events. So not these only sudden acute shocks. And I guess that sea level rise is a good example. And I can think of a beach in Jamaica where they are seeing erosion and where there are people that are calling like a community. So the response is like at a community level when they are actually trying to raise money to help them to face the actual erosion of the beach. Now, there is also, they will attribute directly this erosion of the beach to climate change in their own terms, right? But what I've been seeing with my outsider point of view is that the way they answer to this erosion may also affect the erosion, right? So for the past decade, for the past years, they have been putting concrete on that beach. And then they would say that the sea level rise and the climate change is actually increasing, instead of maybe including the part of the response that they are giving to this first observation, which is, oh, there is erosion, right? So this is a response that I'm keen to better understand when we talk about adaptation and mitigation directly at this coastal level. And in terms of other, because William was talking about reducing the exposure, and this is something that I have seen, for example, for sargassum, which is another shock, which is a shock that people have been experiencing in the Caribbean, and this reduction of exposure, I have seen it through putting floating barriers, right? So that it will not impact the shore directly, and maybe not the mangroves, for example, because when the sargassum will be stuck in the mangrove, there will be a lack of oxygenation, and the trees may die, and even not the trees only, but all the animals, the marine species will be stranded in this sargassum and may die as well. So there is this aspect of exposure reduction that I'm also seeing there.
Thank you, Fred. That's really interesting. It's always great to hear it's always interesting to hear specific examples from the field. Andres, I'll turn to you now, and just given your expertise in blue economy planning around the world, blue economy plans need to think about these kinds of shocks and ways to manage and respond to changing ocean conditions. How are different blue economy plans treating this, thinking about responses?
Thanks, Gerald. And I mean, it's nice because I can kind of build a little bit on what people have already said. Before I said, so blue economy is a very large term that people hear a lot. And so to me, when I use blue economy, I'm thinking about establishing equitable and sustainable ocean sectors. And so that's kind of the lens that I'm speaking to here. And yeah, so if you think about it that way, a lot of the stuff that we've talked about really touches on both, right? Because as Fred was saying, like the sargassum, hurricanes, those are all obviously environmental shocks, and they're going to impact our sustainability. But they also impact equity based on what William was saying, because a lot of the times it's those frontline communities that are the most exposed or vulnerable to those impacts, right? And so if you have a hurricane, for example, and if you have people in low-lying areas or in floodplains, they're going to be much more impacted than people that are in wealthier areas that generally are in places that are less exposed. And actually, I live in British Columbia, and in some of the towns around here, you can see it in the actual housing prices, right? And so, and the realtors will tell you, oh yeah, these houses are really cheap because if there ever was a big storm, they would flood, you know? And so that's where you can really see that difference between the vulnerable communities or the communities that are less able to adapt to these things. And so in terms of blue economy, one really important thing is to sort of address what we know, how we can. So Thomas was talking about this a lot. You know, there are some very real scientific difficulties, aside from any of the political ones, with anticipating shocks or what to do about them. But there are other things that are easier to do, right? So there are other questions that we know better. And you mentioned some of these things. Well, we know the water is going to warm. Exactly what that's going to do, we're not super sure, or we know that the sea level is going to rise. How many more storms a year is going to be, we're not sure, but it's going to be more, you know. And so those are things that we need to do. Again, blue economy being a very much a policy, a very large scale policy thinking, that's where we need to act. And I agree with Marlene, if we can do nature-based solutions, so protecting mangrove or coral reefs or coastal wetlands, those are natural barriers against some of these shocks, right? In other places, we won't have those natural barriers, or cities are already there. And so we will have to make seawalls or do that sort of thing. But I think at a deeper level, what we need to do in blue economy planning is try to sort of distill the effects of shocks as much as we can. You know, so whatever the shock may be, what's going to be the impact overall in these communities? There's going to be loss of food, of income, of employment opportunities, of housing. it is something that we see with a lot of different types of environmental shocks in the oceans. And, so what we need to do is, well, whatever that shock may be, and again, let's anticipate what we think they might be, but let's prepare ourselves for losses of food availability and income and all these sorts of things. And I think that's the part where, well, sort of governments and people, aside from the frontline communities and the oceans, have a big role to play, because, as we said, they often don't have that capacity to, put a big savings account in the bank just in case, and that's where governments need to intervene. I tell you about governments just because in oceans, because of the legal frameworks, it's largely government that is involved in policymaking, right? Obviously, private institutions have a big role to play as well. But anyway, that's where we need to really make sure that we can help people through these times that they're not able to cope with.
Thanks, Andres. That's really thoughtful, interesting points on that issue. And I do want to try to link the two panels a little bit. The last panel, there was quite a bit of discussion, and Andres touched on it as well, as differences between issues that are a little bit more predictable, even just in terms of trends, and things that are less predictable. And maybe those are more kind of socioeconomic issues, transmissible diseases, trade disputes, I think Wolf raised. And so how can we design and implement responses or policies that can be better prepared for or respond to shocks that are a lot harder to predict? And that's a question I'll pose to anyone. I'll try not to put anyone on the spot here.
Yeah.
Marlene.
Thanks. I think a starting point could this could really serve quite well to take equity and justice as a starting point, right? And I think this also aligns with what Yoshi said about sort of already building some kind of mechanism that sort of allows for the establishment of some kind of communication mechanism, or a way in which people that are actually most at risk can actually have a say in the wider governance of ecosystems. I mean, I know that doesn't really ensure sort of a good response, but I mean, if the shock is hard to predict, then it will be really hard to predict what will be a good response. But I think it should be built on the foundation of equity and justice and involvement of the people who are at risk. And I think it also involves some reflection on, for those shocks that are maybe more predictable because of what we are causing in a way, it also requires some reflection on what it means that the people who are least responsible for a lot of these shocks occurring more frequently, what it means for them to actually face most of the consequences. So I think in maybe designing some governance mechanism to deal with these shocks and to come up with responses, I think those should be the building blocks. I don't know how it will go further, but maybe that's a part of the point as well, that a voice should be given to people who are facing most of the consequences without really being responsible for much of it.
Thank you, Marlene. Again, very interesting point, taking us away from just thinking about natural and human-made infrastructures to decisions and governance models. William, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I think I think those are really good points as well. I learned that from the economists, they say that it is almost impossible to try to predict what the market fluctuation is. It's better to be prepared for the fluctuations, and you can gain better from that rather than trying to better predict that. And I think that applies to shock as well, and that having a robust system that can respond to those shocks would be really useful. For example, like in some of the analysis that we did with Thomas and other colleagues, that we look at fisheries specifically, and we find that, for example, having harvest control rules that are designed to address some of the shocks in addition to the long-term change, can actually perform better in the long term, even accounting for the effects of, say, heat waves impacts on fish stocks and fisheries. And that other colleagues have done similar analysis and showed that for specific fisheries as well. But I think that highlights two challenges that we need to deal with. The first thing is about I think that was also mentioned earlier that some of those response measure can also have an impact on people, and that we need to have a mechanism to do that. But continue with the example of the harvest control rules. What it means is that when we see a decrease in fish stocks because of these shocks, like heat waves, then the quotas and the fisheries management measures will then automatically respond to that by, say, lowering the fishing pressure, reducing fishing quota, so that we can allow, we won't be having a stock collapse, for example, because of that, and that would help sustain the fisheries in the longer term. But what it means is that in the short term, we need to coastline the fisheries, and that fishermen's livelihood and incomes will be immediately affected. And we have seen that, for example, for Pacific cod in Alaska, that they have to coastline the fisheries because of the heat waves there. And other things about this is that this kind of mechanisms often also require both scientific knowledge, scientific capacity, institutions, and infrastructure to design and implement. I think that's also a limitations in many regions where they don't have those kind of capacity and or have limitation to access to those capacity. So I think it is important for a democratization of the informations, science to improve that capacity. Another example is that, for example, in Indonesia in 2018, there was a tsunami and it had a quite big impact on Sulawesi. And one of the reasons is that it is not that there isn't a tsunami warning system, but it's that they don't have the funding to support a big monitoring network with gauges that can have accurate and early enough detection systems, as well as the lack of capacity to communicate that warning to the communities to respond to that. So I think that's a different example, but then it highlights a similar point that sometimes those kind of lack of data and knowledge is a barrier to actually implement this kind of system to respond to shocks, and that can be dealt with now because we have the science, but it's just lack that capacity or access to those capacity to design those responses. Thank you.
Thanks, William. There's a lot in there. You talked about capacity to even to respond itself. You talked about temporal considerations, short and long term. You talked about issues of thinking about co-benefits versus trade-offs and doing responses. Again, a lot there. I'll turn to Andres. I want to make sure we get Andres and Fred responding to this here. Before I do, I also want to remind everyone, please post your questions on the Jamboard. I think some people have posted questions for panel 2 on the panel 1 slide. Remember, you can cycle between the slides. Please post your questions and comments. Okay, Andres, I'll turn to you.
Thanks, Gerald. Yeah, a lot of what William said really resonated with me, and I think at a general level, really what we're talking about is, one, making sure that we can dampen these shocks in some ways, right? So we're going to try and anticipate them however much we can, but the dampening part is where policy comes in under a blue economy, right? And so he talked about this a little bit with these harvest control rules, right? That, like, right now it might seem like, oh, why are you reducing my thing because of quota? But the alternative is the stock collapses, right? So really what it's doing is really dampening that signal in a way through our policy. The other part, though, that really resonated was having a baseline for adaptation in place already. And that, I think, is one critical element that often is missing in a lot of places, right? And so to follow from the fisheries example, or it could be aquaculture, really most of the different ocean sectors that we have, often when they're responding to things, you're responding already way behind the 8 ball because you don't have a lot of the necessary information, you know. And so let's say there was a catastrophic heat wave, and all of a sudden people lose access to fishing, and there's loss of income. In many places around the world, including my own country, we have very, very spotty or uncertain information on how many fishers there are, how much income they were actually making, how many people they're supporting, how they're getting things out to market, how do we get to them if they're in rural places. And so all of those things are things that are actually relatively easy to do, you know, like, and obviously there's a lot of capacity shortfalls, whether it be financial or sort of people power to get on respond to these things. But that baseline of an adaptation response, right? That fundamental baseline isn't hard to do. And I think that's where everything sort of starts from. And in doing it, you can identify some of these issues that you might have to contend with. The case that Tiffany said really struck me because, you know, imagine it's such a failure of policy when you think, well, if a barge can't get in through the winter, it's going to make people hard to survive in these places. Well, wait a minute. There's something really wrong here. Like we really should have anticipated some of this a little bit. Like, why are people living in under that risk, you know? And so those are all the things that you can identify with these relatively simple approaches to forming a baseline for what your ocean sector looks like.
Thanks, Andres. We're running out of time here for this panel, but I just want to check in with Fred to see, Fred, do you have any closing thoughts about this issue?
Well, I think I would just add a little bit of perspective about, like, when we talk about justice and equity in answering to climate change and to certain shocks, there are some people who can be left by the governance. And when we look at sectors, also, for example, the way that sectors are differently treated may be an issue, because if as far as I've looked at some case studies in the Caribbean, you know, most of the time there was more emphasis and mainstreaming in terms of response to climate change in the agriculture sector than in the fisheries sector. And so then the fisheries people will always feel like a bit left on the side. So I can think of that. And when we talk about preparation, because in the Caribbean, we always say preparation is key. And what is preparation? Is preparation building better infrastructures, and its preparation is giving people places to put their boats. And they will use mangroves, for example, to store the boats during the bad season, or they would put it at home if they have a chance to do that. But there is also subsidies, and subsidies comes during or after, but it's also included in the response. And subsidies may be also, as I said, directed to some sectors more than others. Yeah, it's another perspective.
Thanks, Fred. So we're a little bit over time for the second panel, so I want to just transition to the third panel, which is great because we're going to bring all 8 panelists together now, and it'll be more of a free-flowing conversation, and a chance for panelists to interact with each other a little bit more and interact with questions posed by the audiences. So I don't think we have a transition slide for panel 3, so we can get right into it. I know that that Wilf actually had his hand up in response to something that was said from panel 2, Wilf and Tiffany. So I might start with you two just to hear your responses, and then I'll pull up some questions from our audience here. So Wilf, maybe I'll start with you because you had your hand first.
Thank you. I totally forgot that, I wasn't part of panel 2. Anyways, I do agree that, dampening, adapting, mitigation, these are all things that we need to do, but at the same time, Andreas mentioned in his opening comment that we know things that are essential, food, income, physical safety. those are things that we should be focusing on creating some kind of safety net to ensure those things are safeguarded regardless of what kind of shock. Because like I said, shocks come in different shapes and forms. We can try to predict it, but at the same time, we should be focusing on making sure these things are available. For example, with the COVID, in the pandemic, Canadian government implemented different types of responses. But generally speaking, fissures tend to come out fairly, fairly unscathed. Part of the reason was because they had this unemployment insurance program that's been in place. The unemployment insurance program wasn't designed with a pandemic as a potential shock in mind, but because we had that safety net program established through past history, they were able to withstand this totally unexpected new type of shock. So that's where we should be focusing on what are the essentials for community, and how do we ensure that kind of essential needs are met even in extreme shocks and conditions.
Thanks, Wolf. So it's an interesting point about how we already have mechanisms in place that can be broad enough social safety nets that can, dampen surprises. Tiffany, I just wanted to turn to you before we go on, because you had your hand up as a response to session 2.
Yeah, apologies for that also. I was just going to say, as someone who's been trained in engineering and is now working in public health, something that I find really unsettling is the fact that this pump upon which we vitally depend, our heart, doesn't have a backup system. And I always wonder, well, why don't we have a backup heart? It would be a lot safer to have this. And it's because evolutionarily that just hasn't made sense for us to develop this. And so that's a really big vulnerability. And I think similarly, Arctic communities now find themselves in a position where they vitally depend, a lot of the coastal ones, on marine shipments for essential goods. And this happens once a year, and it's very vulnerable to biophysical and political and so forth. And I think we have to be very careful about how we frame issues, because if we frame this as an infrastructure, as a biophysical issue, we're going to get new ports and we're going to get roads to the Arctic Ocean. And we've seen this happen. But perhaps it's also the result of the fact that the country food system, the harvest system, has been eroded through colonialism and residential schools and a number of factors that have undermined people's, resilience and their own culture. But it's a lot easier to throw money and to frame things from a technocratic and from an infrastructure perspective. And so, that's all I wanted to add.
Thanks, Tiffany. Before I move on, I know Yoshi and William both have their hands up, but I want to ensure that we get to some of the questions posed by our viewers here. And here's a question that actually, Yoshi and William, you might already be thinking about, and I think it comes naturally from Tiffany's last point about the use of more infrastructural approaches and thinking about decision making. So the question is, if we're focused on decreasing exposure, is there a way to decrease exposure while actually increasing or not affecting democratic decision making? Are those two essentially in a bit of a trade-off? It's open to anyone.
Can I go?
Yeah.
So, William, it's very interesting you brought up the exposure argument, and there was some discussion about nature-based solutions. What I observed after the Indonesian tsunami, so I was there for about right after the year on the tsunami, was a lot of aid came around, and there was many aids which sort of imposing on at that time, pretty much nature-based solutions, like putting more the coral reefs and then let's put more mangroves and, those things. And it really actually put a lot of responsibility shifted in the local communities, and which was really my concern. Then at the same time, the exposure argument, while I agree with you that there will be more exposure, I mean, obviously Thomas' work and your work actually, actually enlighten us, there will be a much more frequency in the heat waves. And then I experienced that in Japan while I was in this summer, and then got quite scared about it. At the same time, the sort of like a community exposure to those issues are really historically, we're talking about like a justice issues, really. So the decision has been made, nature-based solution sometimes is comfortable for many people rather than stopping the industry and then, something else like Tiffany says, and putting more and more sort of like a pressure on the community and the shift in responsibility for the community to prepare of these things rather than having much more sort of like a national-based safety net decisions to be made. I agree with you with the harvest, and I agree with you reducing exposure, but I feel that reducing exposure could potentially means really to put the social safety net first. So the people who are most vulnerable potentially could be vulnerable, which is everyone, but really have a backup system first. Then we can actually make a decision much more towards exposure preventions and potentially either nature or non-nature. I don't really like the distinction between nature and non-nature solutions to that. So I kind of think the first we really have to fix society first, rather than just really rushing into some sort of a very locally based solutions.
William, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's a really good point, Yoshi, and so I think it is a complex question, it's complicated question. So I think everyone would agree that is no one single solutions would be able to fix everything, and that's there are so much differences in context, ecological and socioeconomic context. So really, a lot of the solutions that that if you want to make it effective, that will be going down to tailor it for specific contexts and situations. And I think another thing is important is that we need a portfolio of solutions. I think that's also in building on the others colleagues' comment that I think it is a big problem. It affects so many people and natural system in so many ways that we need actually different perspective and different angle in order to address that. Like, for example, colleagues like Rashid has been championing the usefulness of the universal basic income in solving both social and environmental problems, as we have highlighted. I think that's an important idea to pursue. But then having a robust system in response to shocks, or having developing or democratizations of data and infrastructure and knowledge is another things that we should also do hand in hand. And finally, I just want to highlight one aspect that is I think is also emerged over my discussion is the need to address these questions in an interconnected way. It was highlighted in the recent report jointly published by the IPCC and IPBES that really highlights the importance of, in this particular case, looking at the dealing with challenges associated with ecosystem services, climate change, and social aspects. So social aspect across all these aspects as well. So it is now, I think, recognized, starting or increasingly being recognized that these questions need to be addressed at the same time. So and that's some of the things that Yoshi highlighted is kind of if we just focus on dealing with ecosystem or ecosystem services, then it may trade off against social outcomes. But then it is that the need that addressing this in a more holistic, interconnecting way is needed, and then applying that philosophy and approach to the local context that fit the need or aspiration or desirable futures of that situation. Thank you.
Thanks, William. Again, quite a lot in that exchange. Yeah, I think what we can take from this past hour and a bit is, how complex the issue is. I know you brought up this need for a suite of responses, kind of an integrated perspective, and maybe that leads to a next question I'm going to pose to each one of you. And it's really, in your opinion, what is the one thing or one thing that's really needed to ensure that responses to a changing ocean, particularly sudden shocks, produce equitable outcomes through the decade? Wolf is deep in thought. Can I call someone out to begin? Andres. It looked like you signaled to speak.
I was pointing to someone else who raised their hand.
Oh.
But
Fred has her hand up.
Okay. What's that?
Fred, you have your hand up. You want to start? Save Andres?
I can go after. I can go after.
Okay.
Well, yeah, of course. It's just that, in my opinion, when you talk about an effective community, an effective response that could be at the community level, at the national level, it needs to come from an appropriate share of science, so that when we go and sometimes pretend to consult communities, if we do that without giving a very simple but precise information about the state of knowledge on what is actually happening in the area, I think that just going and consulting population and asking how they perceive or how they think we can, what they think they can do for adaptation, in my opinion, is more about sharing the science to these people that we are consulting and doing it well, that will make a real impact.
Thanks, Fred. Yoshi.
It only has to be a one thing.
Yeah, limit it to one.
Okay. I really do think more of the frequency of this event and the sudden shocks happening, and when, you know, I know you don't, but when disaster happens or when shocks happens and when marine ecosystem is changing so rapidly without really anybody's imagination, any of the decision making has really influenced hugely by the power, and hugely with some of the agendas and some of the narratives and some of the world views. And I really hope and it is one thing I feel that I need is for the scientists to really just, you know, not to be complicit with those narratives and a trend of the opinions, but to really stick to what they actually found and what they actually know about it, and very clear about the limitation and the understanding and I wouldn't say communicate, you know, that's too much, but really the scientists to understand the role in for the science in a sudden shock is really to just stick to your scientific knowledge rather than just pushing any of the agendas. So that's what I think is really necessary for the scientific community to deal with these sudden shocks. And you know, many of the scientists you hear is saying like we are, but the recognition of the injustice happened before actually shows some of the patterns. So that is probably one thing, you know, I would like to think is necessary.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask for our remaining people, try to keep it to like 30 seconds. Andres, we'll go to you.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. Well, one thing is tough, but I think at a fundamental level, and again, thinking about this, your question, right? Equity and more equitable outcomes from ocean shocks. We need to consistently remind ourselves of where the blame lies for these climate change shocks, right? So these communities are the ones that are being affected by them, but we often push a lot of the adaptations and you need to change your lifestyle onto them, and they're not causing climate change by and large, right? And so even though, yes, there's a lot of cool benefits that can be gleaned from conserving local areas, from diversifying your livelihoods, as an economist, like I understand that. But at the end of the day, we owe them, you know, and so I think that's the thing we need to keep in mind when we design. I love Will's idea about these safety nets or any of these sorts of things that we're going to need to do. The one thing we need to remind ourselves of, we owe them these things.
Thanks, Andres. Marlene?
Yeah, basically what Andres and Yoshi said. I think what really ties that together, though, is sort of recognizing limitations of scientific approaches, recognizing responsibility in the global north, and really putting central knowledge and agency of those people, indigenous peoples, local communities, those who are at risk, through us in the global north, basically, with our limited capacity to deal with these shocks on the basis of the science that we have, really put people central, the people who are most at risk and who do have a lot of knowledge and agency over the ecosystems that they are custodians of as well.
Thanks, Marlene. William?
Thanks. I think from the point of view of a scientist or a scholar, I think is to, I think what our committee needs is to communicate more. So what it means, communication is two-way. So first of all is to provide our expertise and knowledge and data so that to support particularly those that have limited access to those important information for responding to changes or even driving some of the bigger scale changes as Andres said, on, for example, for climate mitigation. And then also listening to what the peoples need. So a lot of the time we have our own scientific enthusiasm and interest, but then we also need to listen to what actually are the important limitations and questions that matters to help support the development of those responses and maybe prioritize our effort and resources to address those important questions. So that's my remarks. Thanks very much.
Thanks, William. Let's move to Wilf.
Sure. I think for me, you're going to keep it short. It's the, we talked about lots of complex systems, compounding effects, unintended outcomes. But what we need to stay focused on what's most crucial, and that's vulnerable. What makes certain people vulnerable. It could be economic, it could be public health, and just stay focused on that. Resolving those issues would be my comment.
Great, thanks, Wolf. I think you actually stuck within the 30-second window. Thomas.
Yes, so I basically agree with everything which has been said. So I think we also need to learn better from past events. I think then that comes back a little bit to the baseline issue Andres and William were mentioning. Also in the physical biogeochemical science, actually, we do not really have a good baseline against which extremes can be detected. For example, oxygen and acidity, we do not have a lot of measurements at subsurface. I think that would be something which could be improved to actually improve the baseline and then to better actually understand the context of the extreme events with regard to past events. And maybe also coming back to the exposure argument, reducing the exposure argument. I mean, yeah, I see this point, but we should not somehow forget that the hazards, they are actually increased. I mean, the IPCC report has just concluded so that actually the climate change is already affecting every region across the globe with human influence contributing to many observed changes in weather and climate extremes. So even though you can reduce the exposure, the hazard will probably increase everywhere. Not? So that's not, so there is probably a limited amount you can actually gain with reducing exposure because the hazards will probably increase everywhere. And that we somehow faced that in Switzerland this summer. We were actually thinking, well, we will not be affected by climate change that much, for example, by floods. But we had strong flooding events and heavy precipitation events also here in Switzerland. And people were totally kind of surprised that that could even happen here. So
Thanks, Thomas. With 2 minutes left, you reopened a debate, but that's okay. I mean, it's also, that's really good. I think you also reinforced something you said early on about the need for validation and validating our models. Tiffany, I'll close with you before turning to our general closing.
Yeah, just really quickly, the government response when that barge didn't come was to use military aircraft, the same ones that were used by many countries to evacuate Afghanistan recently, to ship hundreds of thousands of liters of fuel and essential goods to the communities. And obviously this isn't a very good response. So we obviously need to be better prepared, and being better prepared comes with a cost. Safety nets come with a cost, but so do the impacts to people, and these are often unaccounted for. And so I think one of the most important things is to just not hide behind narratives of things being complicated or things being, infrastructure or physical or nature issues. A lot of these are people issues. And so listening to people, as banal as that sounds.
Thanks, Tiffany. So I think we heard quite a few themes here around relevant communication, focusing on vulnerability. We heard that from multiple people. I think Tiffany would just also mention some of that. The need for kind of these ethical considerations and how we go forward with research and policy. Who's responsible for what? The need to challenge power dynamics that keep some people down. So there's like about 1 minute left. I just want to turn it back to Harriet, who's going to just close the session for us and tell you what all this is leading to.
Thank you so much, Gerald, and enormous thanks to the wonderful panelists for starting this conversation. As we mentioned at the beginning of this event, this is just the start. We will be continuing this conversation through some workshops and some follow-up activities. You should all receive an email about this after the event. Please do reply, indicate your interest, and we'll be reaching out. I'd also like to mention there'll be a Nexus Center virtual open house. The link is in the chat. And finally, but most importantly, an enormous thanks to the team at the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center, particularly Constance McBarron, Corinne Atsuka, and Ali Long for helping make this happen. On behalf of Gerald and myself, huge thanks to the panelists. Thank you all for coming, and please stay in touch and keep this conversation going. Have a good day, everyone, and happy weekend.
Thank you to you, Harriet and Gerald.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.